We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Zayin and Beis in Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 57b. On the previous summit, the Gemara said that according to Reish Lakish, let's say you have a situation where an animal is a carbon and it's a Baal Mum and you essentially exchange it for another animal, but Hektish lost out because the first animal was worth more than the second animal. So then Reish Lakish said you have to compensate on a Doraisa level. And the Gemara said we're talking in a situation where the loss to Hektish was exactly the shear of Ona, and yet we say Ein Ona LeHektish, there is no Ona for Hektish, so then why do you have to compensate? And the Gemara says it could be that Reish Lakish holds like Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says, what does it mean there's no Ona for Hektish? It means there's no Toras Ona, meaning Da'afilu Pachos Mechdei Ona Choser, even if it's less than Ona, meaning you have to actually be more strict when it comes to Hektish, and even in a situation where the loss to Hektish was less than the amount of Ona, less than the shear Ona, still you have to compensate, and that would explain Reish Lakish's position. And the Gemara continues, Meisvei, we have a question on Rav Chisda's opinion from the following Brisa. It says in the Brisa, Ribis v'ona lehedyot, there's such a thing as Ribis and Ona when it comes to regular person. Vein Ribis v'ona lehektish, but there is no Ribis and Ona when it comes to Hektish. And Rashi explains, Vein Ribis v'ona lehektish, there's no Ribis or Ona for Hektish. Ein Isser Ona v'Isser Ribis, knowing behektish, there's no prohibition of Ona, there's no prohibition of Ribis when it comes to Hektish. Well, the Kamei Mefarish Heichi Dami Ribis to Hektish, later on the Gemara will explain what it means, what's the case of Ribis by Hektish. In any case, the question over here is, it says again that there's no Ona for Hektish, and Rav Chisda said there actually is Ona for Hektish. It just means to say that it's even more strict when it comes to Hektish. And the Gemara answers, Mi alima mi masnisin, well, is this question any stronger from the Mishnah? Do kimna b'Torah Ona? We say the Mishnah just means to say that there is no Torah Ona when it comes to Hektish, but there is a concept of Ona. It's actually even more strict when it comes to Hektish, and that's what it could mean here as well. Hachinami here also, Ribis v'din Ona lehedyot, it means there's Ribis and the laws of Ona apply to Hedyot, to regular person. Ve'ein Ribis v'din Ona, but there is no Ribis and there's no din of Ona when it comes to Hektish, when it comes to Hektish. And Rashi says, din Ona lehedyot, there's the law of Ona by Hedyot, means to say shasus, meaning we follow 1/6. Ve'ein din Ona lehektish, that din does not apply by Hektish. Again, the afilu pachos mechdei Ona, even if it's less than the amount of Ona, choser, one goes back on the transaction. But the Gemara continues, Ihachi, if that's the case, if that's what the Brisa means, Hainu de Katani Sefer, then how do you explain the end of the Brisa? It says, Zechomer behedyot mi behektish. It says this is something that is stricter by Hedyot from Hektish, but it's not stricter. When it comes to Ona, actually Hektish is actually stricter than Hedyot, according to the interpretation using Rav Chisda. And so the Gemara says, Ribis, well, we'll just say that line's going on Ribis, meaning in terms of Ribis applies to regular person, it doesn't apply to Hektish, that's a stringency. And so the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, listening nami, Zechomer behektish, we should have the reverse, that there's a stringency by Hektish over Hedyot when it comes to Ona, because now we're interpreting that by Hektish, we're actually more strict when it comes to Ona. And the Gemara says, Hachi Hashta, what kind of comparison are you making between the two statements? I understand that you say this is a stringency by Hedyot from Hektish, V'sulo, and you say nothing further than that, Ela Hektish, but when it comes to Hektish, Zeh Chomer V'sulo, is this the only Chumrah and nothing else? Meaning to say, when you're making a comment, Zeh Chomer Behedyot mi behektish, you're saying this is a stringency of Hedyot over Hektish, what you're basically implying is that in general, Hedyot is not more Chomer than Hektish, but in this regard, it's more strict. But if you're going to say this is a stringency when it comes to Hektish, there's a lot of stringencies when it comes to Hektish. So to say that by Hektish, here's a stringency, we're more strict by Ona, that would not make sense. And the Gemara continues, Ribis de Hektish hechi dami. How do you have a case of Ribis by Hektish? The Gemara says, Ilema de ozve gizbor meya b'meya ve'esrim. Let's say you say that the gizbor, the treasurer of the Hektish, he lent money out to somebody, he lent 100, and he was going to be paid 120 back, and that would be a situation of Ribis. But that wouldn't make sense. V'halo moal ha-gizbor. In that case, you're not allowed to use Hektish funds for other purposes. That would essentially be me'ila, would be misuse of Hektish by the gizbor. The Kavan Shemal HaGizbor, and once the Gizbor is Moal, once he misuses the property of Hektish, Yatsu Ma'os of L'chulin, what actually happens is that the money becomes Chulin, V'havalu de Hedyot, it's as if it's money that belongs to a regular person. So of course in that situation there actually would be an issue of Ribis, that can't be the situation. And so the Gemara says, Amar Rav Hoshia says, Hacha b'mayaskin, and here what is the case? Kegon Shekibal olav l'sapik salosas mayarba, a person accepted upon himself that for 4 he was going to supply flour to the Beis HaMikdash, v'yamdu mishalosh, and then it ended up that the price was 3. Kedetanya, as we learned in a Brisa, Hamakavel olav l'sapik salosas mayarba. Let's say a person says that he's going to supply salosas, again that's fine flour, for 4, v'yamdu mishalosh, and then it becomes 3. Misapik mayarba, then he supplies for 4. Mishalosh v'yamdu mayarba, let's say he says he's going to supply for 3, and then it's 4. Misapik mayarba, there also he supplies for 4. Sheyad hektish al ha'elyona, because the halach is that hektish always has the upper hand. And Rashi explains the oz of shehil v'lehedyot, if the case is that he lent to a regular person, meaning the gizbor lent money of hektish to a regular person, v'halomal, that's a problem of mi'ila already. Shehotzi mos hektish l'chulin, he's essentially using that money of hektish for mundane purposes. V'lo hechnes tachtein lehektish klum, and nothing is really substituting for hektish. It's not like a direct exchange. V'shogeg hu etzlo, that's essentially a case of shogeg. It's a mistake. Kisavar shemuter mishum schar hektish. He thought it was okay because hektish is going to profit through the ribbis, and what would happen there is v'havaluhu dehedyot, essentially it would become a regular person's. Shel gizbar, the money would then belong to the gizbar. Sharei olav l'shalim l'hektish karen v'chomish. He immediately has an obligation now to pay hektish, the principal and a fifth, and so that can't be a good example of ribbis by hektish. And so then the Gemara said, Hacha b'mayaskin, and here what is the case? Hayde katani ein ribbis l'hektish. When we say there's no ribbis for hektish, lav b'halva koi, we're not talking about a loan. Ela behedyot shekibel mos min halishka. What we're talking about is that a regular person, he gets money from the chamber of the Beis HaMikdash, min hagizbar, from the treasure, l'sapix losos kol hashana l'menachos shel tzibor, and it's in exchange for the fact that he's going to supply the fine flour all year long for the karban minchas of the community. Arba soin b'sela, and the deal is he's going to provide 4 saw for every sela. That's the original price. V'hukru, and then things become more expensive. V'yamdu mishalosh soin b'sela, and now a sela only is able to supply 3 saw. Now the ilu hedyot, that if you have a situation, whereas if you would have had a situation not dealing with the Beis HaMikdash like this, so asur lifsok al peros at shiyatza hashar, you're not allowed to make deals like that until the shar, which means to say essentially until there's a marketplace that is established. V'kan afilu lo yatza hashar adayin la'arba poskin, here, even if you don't yet have a market value that is set, the price has not been set in the market, you're still allowed to set that up. It's not a problem. And as we said, yad hektish is al ho'elyona, so that's something that related to ribbis. According to the halachas of ribbis, if you were dealing with a regular person, you wouldn't be allowed to establish a deal like that. It would be problematic because of ribbis, because again, the market price can change, but that's not a problem when it comes to hektish, and in this case, yad hektish will always be al halyona, will always have the upper hand, meaning to say you always have to supply 4 saw per sela. And the Gemara continues with another answer how you can have ribbis for hektish. Rav Papa says, Hacha ba'avnei binyan hamesuros legizbar askinon. Here what we're talking about is you have stones that are to be used for the building of the Beis HaMikdash, and they're given over to the gizbar, kiddush Shmuel, and it's following what Shmuel said. The Amar Shmuel, because Shmuel said, bonin b'chol, when you actually build with these stones, what happens is it's considered to be chol. It's not yet considered to be hektish at the time that you're building. V'yachar kach makdishan, and then after it's built, we make it hektish, we make it part of the Beis HaMikdash, and so essentially what we're saying in that case is if he would lend out those stones, so they're really chol in terms of the halachas of me'ila, that wouldn't be a problem in terms of the halachas of me'ila, but it is considered to be hektish in terms of ribbis, and there would be no problem of charging interest. Rashi explains, Rav Papa says, Liolam behalva, really we are talking about a loan, the ozif meya b'meya v'esrim, it's a loan of 100 for 120. With the kasha lachalomal, now the question was, isn't there a problem of me'ila? The answer is, ba'avnei binyan, we're talking about stones used for building askina, and that's what we're talking about. Shehilva hagizbar mehen lehedyot, that the gizbar lent from them to a regular person. De'ein bahen me'ila, there's no me'ila over there. V'yein al hagizbar l'shalim, the gizbar doesn't have to pay. El shliach bi'almu, he's just considered to be an agent. Diamar Shmuel bonin b'chol, because Shmuel said you build with things that are considered chol, meaning kashein bonin binyane hektish. When they're building things related to hektish, lo hayukonin ha'avonim v'hatit mimos hektish. They don't use money of hektish to buy the stones and to buy the mortar. Kadei shelo yavo ha'umnin v'am lidei me'ila, because they don't want people to come to me'ila. Im yashvu aleim, maybe they're going to sit on them. Or im yehenu mehem, or they'll derive some other benefit from them. Ela lochin b'hakafa. Rather, what it means is it's bought through a credit. V'hareihin chol, and it's considered to be chol. It's not considered to be hektish at the beginning, until it's actually built into the wall, and then once it's built into the wall, nosin bo is hektish, that's when they give the money of hektish, it's at that moment that they buy it, and that's when it becomes hektish. Or let's say you have another scenario, let's say somebody donates stones, you give it to the builder, you don't call it hektish yet, until you put it in the building, that's why there's no me'ila, and that would be a scenario again of ribbis for hektish. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, Ein bohen tashlum kefil. There is no kefil, there's no double payment when it comes to the items listed in the Mishnah. And the Gemara says, Munahani mili, from where do we know this? The Tanur Rabbanon, because the rabbis taught, I'll call devar pesha. It says in the pasuk, I'll call devar pesha. Klal, that is a generalization. Al shor, al chamor, al sal, salma. It says on the ox, the donkey, the sheep, the garment, prat. That's a specification. Al kol aveda. Then it says on all lost objects, asher yomar It says, Al kol aved asher yomar chazer uklal. That's another generalization. Klal uprat uklal yat adon elakein aprat. If you have a klal uprat uklal, the halach is that it applies to anything similar to that which was specified. Mahaprat mefurish davar hametaltel v'gufo mammon. Just like what was specified, these are things that move around and they themselves have monetary value. Af kol davar hametaltel v'gufo mammon. So to anything that's a movable object that has monetary value, that's going to be included in the halach of kefel. And so therefore we exclude Yatsu Karkos, Sheina Metaltalin, we exclude land which is not Metaltalin, Yatsu Avodim Shehukshu Lekarkos, we exclude slaves which are compared to Karka, they're compared to land, Yatsu Shtaris, and we exclude documents, Shafa Bisha Metaltalin, even though that is a movable object, Ein Gufan Mammon, it has no monetary value, meaning intrinsic monetary value, it's just used to collect a debt. And finally, Hekdeshus, when it comes to Hekdesh, how do we know that's excluded? Amar Krotz, because the Pasuk says Re'eyu, it says Re'eyu means to say his friend, Re'eyu velo Hekdesh, it applies to Re'eyu, it does not apply to Hekdesh. And Rashi says, I'll call Dvar Pesha, Sefer Dekra, Mishtoi, Betoin Tainas Ganev, O Beganev Atzmo. The end of that pasuk is talking either about Toin Tainas Ganev, which is a case of a shomer that tries to get out of being responsible by claiming it was stolen from him, then it turns out he's the Ganev, or the end of the pasuk is talking about the Ganev himself. Either way, that's relevant to Kefel. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "Velo tashlumei dalid v'hei." There's also not the payment of 4 or 5 times the amount by these items. And the Gemara says, "My time, what's the reason for that?" Tashlumei dalid v'hei amar achmona, because it says 4 or 5 times the amount. Velo tashlumei shlosha v'yarbo. It's not a payment of 3 or 4 times the amount. Meaning, once we've already excluded kefel, so then it's not going to be 4 times the amount. It's going to really be 3 times the amount, and it's not going to be 5 times the amount. It's going to be 4 times the amount because we took away that 1 extra from the kefel. But therefore, there is no concept of tashlumei shlosha v'yarbo. That's why dalid v'hei is excluded from these items. And Rashi explains, "V'lo tashlumei shlosha v'arba." It's not a payment of 3 or 4 times, meaning shlosha l'seh. That would end up being 3 times the amount for a sheep. A sheep's supposed to be 4 times the amount, but if you took away the kefil, it's only 3, and that's not a thing. V'arba l'shor, and 4 times the amount for an ox, which really should be 5. To kevan de imit mi kefil. Once again, these things are excluded from kefil. Batzer l'huchada. So then 1 times the amount is already subtracted. Shah kefil b'tovech u'mocher bechlal tashlumei daled v'hei, because kefil is included in the 4 or 5 times the amount. If you take out the kefil, it becomes 3 and 4 times the amount. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Shomer Chinam Eino Nishba, that a Shomer Chinam doesn't take an oath on these items. The Gemara says, Mino Hanimili, from where do we know that? The Tanu Rabbanan, as the rabbis taught, Ki Ite Nishal Reyehu, the Pasuk says a person gives to his friend, that's a klal, that's a generalization. Kesef Okelim, it says that it's Kesef Okelim, so that's a prat, that's a specification. And the Mesoras Hashas changes this to Lishmor, to watch, Chazar Klal, that's another generalization. So we have here Klalu Pratu Klal, we have here again a Klalu Pratu Klal, Iatadon Elakain HaPrat, it only applies to things similar to the prat. Mahaprat mefurish davar metaltal v'gufo mammon, just like the prat, these are things that are movable and they have intrinsic monetary value. Af kol davar hametaltal v'gufo mammon, so too this applies only to movable objects with intrinsic monetary value. Yatsu karkos she'eino metaltalin, that excludes land which is not a movable object. Yatsu avodim shehukshu lekarkos, it excludes slaves because they're compared to land. And yatsu shtaros she'af avisha metaltalin ein gufon mammon, it also excludes documents, even though it's movable object, even though they're movable objects, but they have no intrinsic monetary value. And hekdeshos, what about hekdesh? Why is that excluded? Amar Krutz, because the pasuk says reyehu, again it says his friend reyehu v'lo shel hekdesh. We understand to mean reyehu and to exclude hekdesh, not of hekdesh. And Rashi explains v'chayite and lekaman b'hashoel. Later on in Parak HaShoel Amina, we're going to say Parsha Rishona Nemra b'Shomer Chinam, that this first Parsha is talking about Shomer Chinam. That's why we know this is talking about Shomer Chinam. Shniya b'Shomer Zachar, the second is by Shomer Zachar. Because of a Parsha Rishona v'Nikra Balabayis, and it says in that first Parsha it talks about Shvua. V'Kimna l'Shvua b'Mafkid, we say it's talking about Shvua. The point over here is we're learning out that you don't swear on these kind of items like land, etc. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, no say Sachar, Eino Meshalim, also Shomer Sachar, he doesn't pay. Where do we know that from? Minohani Mili, from where do we know that? The Tanur Rabbanan, as the rabbis taught, Ki Ite Ishal Reyehu. Again, it says a person will give to his friend klal, that's a generalization. Chamor o shor o seh prat, it says chamor, shor, and seh, that's specification. V'chol behem malishmor, and then it says any animal to watch. Chazer u klal, that's another generalization. Klalu prat u klal, iat adon elkein prat. Again, we say if you have a klalu prat u klal, we only talk about things that are similar to the prat. Mahaprat mefurish davar metaltal v'gufo mammon, just like the prat is movable objects and something with intrinsic monetary value. Af kol davar metaltal v'gufo mammon, so too the halachas by Shomer Sachar, it applies by something that's movable and has intrinsic monetary value. Yatsu karkos she'eino metaltal, and to exclude land which is not movable. Yatsu avadim shukshu lekarkos, to exclude slaves that are compared to land. Yatsu shtaros, and to exclude documents. She'af al pi she'metaltal, and even though it's movable in gufon mammon, it has no intrinsic monetary value. And hekdeshos, also by hekdesh amar kara re'ehu. The pasuk says his friend re'ehu v'lo shel hektish. We understand that to mean his friend and not of hektish. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said shomer chinam eino nishba v'chulu. It said a shomer chinam doesn't swear, and that was talking about hektish. And the Gemara asks, or a minute we have the following contradiction from a Mishnah in Shkolim: B'nei ha'ir shesholchu es shiklein. If the people of the city they sent their machatzis hashekel v'nignevu o sha'avdu, and they were stolen or lost, im mishenisru mahatruma, if the money was already taken from the chamber. And Rashi here says shiklein shkolim shel adar. These are the shkolim that were sent in adar lekarbanos tzibur. The purpose of the machatzis hashekel was to use as funds for the public karbanos. V'nignevu min hashluchin. And so then the people they sent their machatzis hashekel with agents, and it was stolen from the agents. So it says im mishenisru mahatruma means im keshebo ladin. If when they come to court about this, because they're essentially saying that it was stolen and the agents should be responsible. If at that point in time kvar nisru mahatruma shayur tormin halishka begimel kupos, they had these 3 boxes, 3 containers, and they would take from the chamber, again, in order to use the funds to provide these public karbanos, if that money was already taken from the chamber. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Ches Amud Aleph.